Hello and welcome back to Modern World History. In the last video, we discussed the scientific revolution, and in this video, as promised, we're looking at the Enlightenment period, which was kind of coincided with, maybe came a little bit after time frame wise the scientific revolution, which was more in line with the Renaissance time frame. But the idea behind the Enlightenment is going to be a continued focus on some form of change based on the same concepts of reason, thought, problem solving, even observation, in the same sense that people are going to start thinking about the way that they understand science and start trying to understand science through observation. People are going to use reason first and foremost to understand how they fit into the world, and mainly they're looking at this in the scope of politics and society. All right, so those are the main things here that we're focusing on with the Enlightenment movement. And so kind of the beginning of this would be the idea of social contract, all right, which is this contract that we buy into whenever we allow a government to rule over us. And it works like this. According to Thomas Hobbes, people that live under a government are giving up. They are absolutely giving up their freedoms in exchange for order. Okay, and the reason is simple. It's because in a state of nature, life is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. In other words, he believes in a negative outlook, towards human nature. We'll say negative human nature. So basically, everyone's selfish. Everyone wants what they want for themselves, and they would do anything to have what they want, even at the expense of taking other human life. Take this example. Let's say that if there's no government or nothing to stop me, what would stop me from if you came riding your bicycle down the street and I just threw a stick in the spokes, flipped you over your handlebars, and I grabbed your bike and went on? If you can't stop me from doing that, then I get to do it. And so that's how life is going to be in a state of nature, according to Thomas Hobbes. People are going to do whatever they want to do, and they're driven by their own selfish motives. Another good example of this is if you've watched The Walking Dead, that's kind of how people would live. It's almost this my survival comes at your expense kind of mentality here. So according to Hobbes, rulers, in order to be able to put down this I guess selfish state of nature, need to be an absolute monarch. It's the only way that you're going to have a strong enough government to control the selfish humans that would kill themselves if not for the order that's established through government. Now, John Locke is going to come around and he's going to look at this from a different lens, and he's going to say that people are actually capable of doing great things, and he's going to have a positive outlook on human nature. And he believes that people can govern themselves. A government should not be this all-powerful entity that tells people what to do and they have no say. Rather, the government should only exist if the people want it, and it should work to protect the natural rights that he says is going to be life, liberty, and property. All right. So if you're thinking, well, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, well, that right there was a paraphrase, properly plagiarized directly from this idea of natural rights from John Locke. And you know what? A lot of people do believe in that. And so John Locke was kind of, in a lot of ways, he and many of these other philosophers we're going to learn about in this period, influenced the way our Constitution, our Declaration, was written, and the way we formed our government. You can see the parallels as we learn about these enlightened thinkers. Okay, so if a government, by the way, under John Locke, was not protecting these things, then the people were expected to rebel if these were not protected, right? Because you don't want your government becoming so strong that you can't, that oppresses your your natural rights, if it's becoming so strong that it oppresses your natural rights and it's worn out its welcome, and it's time for the people to stand up against it, which is what we did with our Declaration of Independence. So, I want you guys to know this term, philosophes. That's French for philosopher, right? Nancy Clancy knows it all. Philosophes lived in Paris, which was kind of the capital, if you will, for enlightened thinkers during this time frame, and which is ultimately ironic because the monarchs, which had left Paris to live in Versailles only a few miles away, in fact were very, very much absolute rulers and were completely out of the enlightened thinkers loop here. But these philosophes basically had 5 core beliefs, and that is the idea that reason should guide us in our science, in our logical thinking, in our way of living our lives. Reason should be the guiding factor. Also, nature, according to the philosophes, was good and reasonable. Whatever was natural is going to be good and reasonable. Everyone should strive for happiness, and happiness should be attainable for everyone. Progress means to improve society, and we should be centered on trying to improve society. And then this idea of liberty. And what they're meaning here is liberty from absolutism. And you're going to see why this looks like during the French, when we talk about the French Revolution. All right, I'll just write a note here. But we're definitely going to look and see what kind of liberty we're talking about when we study that in a few videos. So Voltaire, so far we looked at Thomas Hobbes, who believed in the idea of absolutism, and John Locke, who opposed him. Both of these guys are going to follow the idea of a social contract, but John Locke believes that human nature is good and they can govern themselves. And Voltaire is going to kind of expand on that a little bit, and he wrote 70 books of essays. He used satire in his writing. His writing was extremely controversial at the time. He was jailed twice for this. By the way, Voltaire is a pseudonym. He actually used this name for his writings, and that's definitely the name that everyone knows him by. He also fought for tolerance, reason, freedoms of speech and religion. I think that this right here is probably the main thing that you need to know about him for the sake of this course. And this quote here is an important quote, I guess a very well-known quote by Voltaire. I do not agree with a word you say, but will defend to the death your right to say it. And that really does sum up the very concept of freedom of speech that we find is so important to our society today. Also, when we were looking at the British, I guess the way the parliaments were trying to take power from the British monarchs in the previous units, we were talking about how one of the things that people did was that Parliament enacted was laws that prevented the king from being able to just put people in jail for disagreeing with him. Well, Voltaire would have agreed with that move. He would have thought that was great. Montesquieu is another philosopher who believes in the idea of separation of powers. Now, he thought at the time that Britain was the best and most fair government because he believed that they did institute this separation of powers. But really, maybe that's a little bit of an exaggeration, but nevertheless, separation of powers definitely becomes part of the framework for the U.S. government. Part of U.S. Government framework. And he believed that power must be kept in check by power. And so this right here in our government is the reason why we have 3 branches: the executive, the legislative, and the judicial. And it works like this. This right here is the president. These right here are your lawmakers, your senators, and representatives. Let's say reps. And then judicial is going to be your judges, your Supreme Court. Supreme Court. And the way that these things work is that president can't just have a blank check to be able to do whatever he wants to do because he's not a king. He must consult Congress, and Congress is also designed to make laws and also limit the powers of the president, and anything that's seen to be unconstitutional can be overturned by the Supreme Court. So these three different powers keep each other in check in the same way that Montesquieu would have envisioned it. And so really and truly our government is centered on this very thing. Rousseau was another philosopher who was committed to individual freedoms, and so he advocated for direct democracy. Now, direct democracy is not what we have today in the United States. We are a republican democracy, meaning that we vote for representatives, senators, and House representatives that will make laws local level, and then when we elect president, we vote for electors that will represent us when they go and vote for the president on our behalf. And so we don't directly influence. That would be a lot of work. Imagine if every single law that was made required people to go and vote directly for it, or every single thing required a direct human presence or human vote. And so really, Republican-style democracy like we have, or representative democracy, is way easier for a large country like us. If you were living in like an Italian city-state, or maybe Athens, then perhaps direct democracy would work better. But Rousseau absolutely believed in that idea. And he also believed social contract was an agreement among people to create a government. And he didn't really think that the government should be something that's going to attack the natural rights of people, kind of like John Locke in that regard. Nobility and titles should be abolished. Locke did not advocate for this, so Rousseau may be a little bit more liberal in this regard, but he believed that nobility and titles led to probably what we would consider today government waste. I mean, you got these largely talentless individuals, depending on where you are, especially in France, where Rousseau lived, that just kind of live at the expense of everyone else. And we're going to see leading into the French Revolution. So it makes sense why he would want that. But that's one thing that distinguishes him from John Locke. Beccaria was another philosopher who wanted to enact some criminal justice reform. And so many of the things that Beccaria was writing about: don't torture people, no cruel punishment, speedy trials. We talked last unit about habeas corpus, or habeas corpus. I probably misspelled this. Sorry if I did. And the idea that you can't just have someone in jail because the king wants them there. You can't just keep them in jail indefinitely without a trial. And he also believed that the punishment should be based on the crime. You can't kill somebody because they, stole a pack of gum from the store. And so many of Beccaria's ideas are applied also to our criminal justice system and other criminal justice systems in the world. Mary Wollstonecraft is different because she is clearly female, but she advocated for women's education. That's one thing where the Enlightenment kind of fell short, is that there wasn't a whole lot of emphasis here, at least not yet, on women and where they're supposed to fit in and on their equality in the grand scheme of things or in a social order. And so women often were overlooked. Mary Wollstonecraft advocated for women's education. She also disagreed with Rousseau that women's education should be secondary to men. So this here is again proof that we look at someone as smart and as liberal as Rousseau in his way of thinking for this time, and to not include women in that is kind of a slap in the face to all ladies. Sorry ladies, Mary Wollstonecraft's got your back. So what was the legacy of all of this? The legacy of the Enlightenment? Well, we're still doing one thing here that I don't know if I've got in here or not. One thing here is we are still impacted today by the changes that were brought forth by the Enlightenment. This is how we form our government. This idea that we can still continue to reform society, be better for everyone, is very, very much a product of this movement in history. So we have new ideas. We have secular thinking and questioning. We have belief in progress. We have importance of individuals to be able to make a difference. This used to be just nobility and kings. All right. So we also have the justification for revolutions in the Americas and in France, and we're going to see this in the next several units, where there's just going to be a lot of revolution that kind of stems from this Enlightenment movement. So not only were these philosophers, these enlightened thinkers, spreading these ideas in Paris and in other parts of Europe, but the ideas started to spread to other parts of Europe as well as to some of your absolute monarchs. And so we call these guys, a king with absolute power. Another word for that is a despot. Okay, so we're talking about absolute power. And these guys here were going to be enlightened despots. In other words, despots or absolute kings are going to put into practice some of the ideas behind the Enlightenment. And one of these dudes is Frederick II, the same Frederick II that we were talking about, who did a lot of reform in Prussia. He was the king of Prussia, and this here is what he looks like. He enacted religious freedom. He was tolerant religiously for all the different various types of religious groups that lived in Prussia at the time, mainly for Protestants and Catholics. He also reduced censorship. When we talk about censorship today, it means like things that the government doesn't want you to be able to know or doesn't want you to hear, things that the news may report. He reduced censorship. He advocated for better education and also abolished torture. Frederick II was the first to make the statement that he, as king, was the first servant of the state. In other words, when we use this word servant, that's very different from how you look at Louis XIV and how he considered himself to be the law itself, or he is the state. Well, Frederick II was the first servant of the state, kind of elevating his role to not just be someone who oppresses or governs with an iron fist, but someone who is going to serve his people. Very, very much an enlightened idea. Joseph II of Austria, he was the successor of Maria Theresa that we talked about, and he also advocated for freedom of religion, which makes sense because his empire is extremely diverse. Extremely diverse empire. And so this was kind of important, something that would make people maybe respect him more as a leader. He also did what many of the other monarchs during this time didn't have the guts to do, in particular with Russia, and he abolished serfdom. Serfdom is the idea that you have these peasant serfs that are tied to a village owned by a landowner, a landowner, like a rich nobility, that's going to force these people to work so that they can make the land profitable for the nobility. Obviously, you can imagine this here is going to outrage nobility, and it was undone after his very short reign. And then lastly, you've got Catherine the Great of Russia. And she's going to enact legal reforms, freedoms of religion, and she's going to advocate for the abolishing of torture and capital punishment, and she expands Russia's borders. And so this sums up our discussion of the Enlightenment and of the enlightened despots. In the next video, we're going to start breaking it down and looking and seeing how this manifests itself in the form of revolutions. Thank you for watching.